think when we think about the long term, small sustainable changes, like that is how you transform your climbing.
Hello everyone, today I'm going to be sharing a conversation I had with a climbing dietitian called Chiara, and she can be found on Instagram simply at climbing dietitian. Throughout this conversation she shared her top tips for fueling as a climber, and there's a lot of positive takeaways even if you're not a climber. We're going to delve straight into this and see what she has to say. To start with, I noticed the first thing you put on your Instagram, for example, where we got in touch, was you were pro food. Sorry, 1 second. My brain's a bit tired today. Pro food dietitian.
Okay. So I'm a registered dietitian. So the process for that, there's an undergraduate degree focused on dietetics. In 2024, it'll be a master's degree. So I'm grandfathered in, but I wanted to do it anyway. So I'm getting a master's in applied exercise science and sports nutrition. Currently, I'm almost halfway through. And then to be a dietitian, you do a year of supervised practice. So I did that Yale New Haven Hospital 2 years ago, and then you sit for your boards. So that's kind of the process. And the reason I throw pro food in there, a lot of times when you hear someone say they're a dietitian, people think of fruits and vegetables, they think of weight loss, they think of supplements, a lot of like really stereotypical things that sometimes, in some ways with lots of nuance work into like what it means to be a dietitian. But I'm a really big fan of intuitive eating, having a positive relationship with food. I struggled with bulimia for a long and miserable decade. So I'm a really big fan of like helping people to find balance, which involves all foods. So that's really where that pro food comes from.
Awesome. And I think that's something that like a lot of people I've spoken to already who are like really like pushing forwards in whatever specialty they're taking the focus in. It really comes from like self-struggling to like passion to like share that. Like particularly with myself as a climber, I was a terrible climber when I started, and many weaknesses. Like people talk about low-hanging fruit. All I seemed to have at the time was low-hanging fruit. So really like learning that process is what drove me to want to teach it.
Right.
And I mean, learning that I can, like when you realize that you can achieve, I think that's such a powerful thing to then be able to pass on to people.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And being able to really relate with someone, like healing my relationship with food and recovering from an eating disorder. Like, I mean, it's totally changed every aspect of my life. Like I can never stress enough how much it's just every bit of my life is so different. And I never thought that would happen. When I first started my recovery on my own, I was like, oh, I can manage this. This can be better, but I never thought it would be something that wouldn't be part of my life anymore. And so, it's really gratifying to be able to like help someone who's kind of like in more of a dark place and help them move like into somewhere that's different, while also being able to like, get stronger and like fully enjoy climbing.
And I think that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's like, how can we get more from our climbing? And it's a bit of a topic I'm going to be discussing soon, is this idea I only climb for fun. And most people do climb for fun, like, and just some people are like trying to get a bit more out of that, and be that through nutrition, through flexibility, through strength training, or technical practice, or learning new outdoor skills. There's so many facets to climbing, which is one of the things that makes it fun.
Yeah, I think it's nice to have that balance, right? Like, I think we can focus so much on sending that it's no longer fun anymore.
Definitely.
And I think when it's only fun and you're not like focusing on getting better and like paying attention to like your movement or your technique or like whatever, then I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's less fun.
So what I'd like to get into today, if you've got tips, or like, because it can be a really messy world of nutrition out there, particularly when you dive into opinions. It's part of climbing that one reason I reached out to yourself is having more resources to let people learn more about nutrition. And for me, if I focused on absolutely everything there is in climbing, I'd never have any time to actually teach what I have learned.
Right.
So I'd like to, like, if you've got tips for climbers, to actually test that and see if we could put that out to some people.
100%. Yeah. So the first one, so I have 5. And so the first one that comes to mind, and I've already kind of talked about this a little bit already, but having a more positive relationship with food is like always the number one for me, because everything is going to like flow out of that. And if you have a negative relationship with food, meaning that like you have food rules that you follow, like only eating at certain times or only eating certain things on climbing days or something like that. Or let's say you have, you know, labels that you attach to food, like broccoli is good and donuts are bad, or you know, the amount that you eat or the type of food that you eat that causes guilt. Like all of those sorts of things, not eating when you're hungry, like kind of forcing yourself to wait. Those are all like really common things that I'll see with like a more of a negative relationship with food. And those sorts of things, first of all, they like kind of keep you from living like a free life and like fully enjoying food for like what it's supposed to be. But it also tends to keep people from fueling adequately. So like if you're worried about eating before you're climbing, you may go into a session underfueled. Or if you're afraid of eating carbs, you're probably going into sessions underfueled. Or you're not really fully replenishing your glycogen stores like after climbing. So that's definitely like a big thing that we'll focus on is, you know, just developing a more positive relationship with food, kind of improve it.
Really important. I feel like something I've mentioned, been bringing up a lot recently, is people are looking for this golden bullet, be that nutrition or whatever. And for me, it's like people look at the pros and say, and I think I mentioned this to you a bit in person, they look at the pros and say, they're slim, so I need to get slim. I need to not eat. When those guys became athletes by fueling properly, having a high, increasing their ability to do more,
right?
And that more that they were able to do by fueling and resting properly is what gave them that body in the long term. People think like, oh, if I lose weight in 3 months, I'm going to go 4 grades up.
Right.
As a coach, I've never witnessed like that sudden change give that sudden result.
Yeah. And a lot of times too, there's a very defined pathway from restriction to like binging or overeating. And so I see a lot of people trapped in like a binge restrict cycle where like they're trying to lose weight. And so they're sort of trying to cut back. They're trying to avoid bad foods. You know, they're trying to eat clean, and they make it through the day or they make it through the week, but then it gets to the evening, it gets to the weekend and their bodies are deprived. And you know, they'll end up overeating, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I screwed up, I have to cut back. And then they kind of, you know, wind themselves up again, you know, to make that big swing. And so a lot of people, it's, you know, getting out of that cycle has to do with, again, like being less restrictive, actually eating when you're hungry, eating what you want so that you're not feeling deprived, you're actually like getting satisfied.
Which I think is really important, because obviously strength to weight ratio, weight is part of an equation. But it's losing it for me, and at least in my opinion, the long-term solution. We're losing it long-term, not like crashing. And this is where we crash, and then we get hungry.
So the next tip that I talk about, this is one that I talk about in my first coaching session, in like the 3-month program that I have. And so this one is like eating consistently throughout the day. And so when I generally think about fueling, I think about multiple layers. Layer 1 is eating enough food throughout the day. And then layer 2 would be kind of balancing your meals. So like your balance of carbs and protein and things like that. And then layer 3 is getting more specific, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but getting more specific with pre, mid, and post-workout fueling. So like timing and composition of your pre-workout meals versus your mid-workout meals versus your post-workout meals. And so, you know, the foundation of that is eating food throughout the day. And it's really hard to be specific about like, are you getting 0.3 grams of protein per kilo after climbing if you're not eating after climbing, right? So like layer 1 would be eat something. Layer 2 would be eat carbs and protein. And layer 3 would be like, you know, let's be more specific about that. But yeah, I think it's, you know, it's impossible to like tweak your nutrition when there's like, you know, no energy that's coming in. So that's a big one.
That sounds very similar to the concept for me. Like if someone's not going to a place where they can train, climbing wall, home gym, the plan's pointless. Like if I can't, I've programmed it with people before where it has been day 1, go climbing. Wednesday, go climbing. Next Thursday, Friday, go climbing if you're feeling it.
I so appreciate that though, because you have to start where you're at. Like there is nothing that's more demoralizing and more confidence shattering than like starting 3 steps ahead of like, you know, where you are. Like it just makes it totally unrealistic. And I think people tend to get overwhelmed and then feel like they're failing. So yeah, I think, yeah, super important. And then a lot of times once you get that foundation down, you're like, oh, okay. And then you can end up kind of building on that.
One thing you mentioned there that I see a lot of people miss out on is that fueling while climbing.
Yes.
Particularly with young people I teach, I'm like, right, bring some water, bring some snacks. And if I have to continue to say to particularly parents, don't bring your young climbers to a session hungry.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. 100%.
Straight from school into a climbing class. I know it's hard.
Absolutely.
At that point, I would rather them have some crap food. Like what we call crap food as a cook. Like I'd rather them have cake and cookies and biscuits.
Oh my goodness. Absolutely.
That's great sugar before we climb. But it's also like, it has gone too right. Like too much sugar can totally lose the focus. But like, I'd rather do that than have somebody tired, dehydrated, hungry.
Oh my goodness.
Now
I mean, you're starting so far behind of your potential when you have no fuel, right? Like climbing is hard enough with fuel. Like without fuel, you're just like, you're starting so far behind. And yeah, I think I see that a lot with young athletes. Like the school schedule is crazy. I'm sure it's even harder to eat right now, like with COVID. Yeah. And their meals can be at crazy times. Like I wish schools were set up for more intuitive eating where like ideally you'd be able to eat when you're hungry, right? Which is just like not the way most schools work, not the way most jobs work. But yeah, definitely a huge challenge. So mid-climbing fueling is very similar to pre-climbing fueling in like this less than 60-minute window, where really what you want is quick digesting carbs. So things like bagels or, fruit is great. Or like I've been really into dates recently. So like dried fruit is a really great kind of condensed, source of carbohydrates. And the great thing about mid-climbing fueling, climbing when you're full does not feel good. And so if I'm not sure how hungry I am, I'll err on the side of less. And then if I'm feeling hungry in my session, I'll kind of top off. Because sometimes if you're like, like you can be not over full and feel perfectly comfortable and then start climbing and realize you're climbing over full. You know what I mean? Like you're not over full, but the second you start climbing, you're like, you feel your, the harness in your stomach. And yeah, it's just like everything's getting squelched in there. So yeah, like having a granola bar on you, or having a handful of dates, or having a couple mini bagels or a few bananas. I've also started like some days I'll mix my own sports drinks, because those are just a great way to get some liquid carbs in. And sometimes like our gym, I have to go outside if I'm going to eat right now, and so it's just I always have my water bottle on me. And so I usually have flavored water, which has no calories. And so I've just started like going lighter on the flavored water, dumping a few tablespoons of sugar in there. And then that's, an easy way to get in some extra carbs. So number 3 has to do with eating consistently throughout the day. And this is just generally eating enough carbs. So I actually don't, maybe there's been like a handful of climbers that I haven't had to recommend, like you really need to eat more carbs. Almost all of my climbers are not eating enough when we start working together. So carbs are your body's main source of energy. They're incredibly important. They should make up at least 45 to sometimes up to 65% of like your calories. And so one way that I'll explain this to people is that, they should cover like at least a quarter of your plate. And that's on like a light or a rest day. Ideally on a moderate day, it would be a third. And on a hard day or a crag day or a comp day, it would be like a half. Which for some people is a lot. Like, they tried having 1 slice of toast and I'm like, no, maybe you need like 2 or 3 slices of toast, right? Like just needing all of that energy.
My fruit intake on a day at the crag is huge.
Yeah.
And it used to be like, and I say fruit for me because particularly on a trad day more than anything else, I'm doing a lot of slower, lower energy moves or projects that are a bit harder. So I'm not doing that high intensity indoor gym sort of.
Right.
When I'm going sport climbing, I like to sneak a bit of licorice in there. It's just
beneficial in a lot of ways, because if you are kind of continually working, um, if you have a meal that has more protein, fiber, or fat, that's going to slow down your digestion. So if you have a bigger meal that includes those things, ideally you would have a couple hours before you started back up again, right? Which it does. I'm assuming that's not
Yeah.
really how things go. And so, yeah, like, I mean, some studies will say, depending on like how intense the activity, 30, 60, 90 grams of carbs an hour. And so, yeah, like a steady kind of inflow of carbs can be really helpful. And definitely something, if we're talking about outside of climbing, definitely something that should be incorporated in like all main meals and snacks. So when I'm thinking about like non-negotiables for my meals, it's definitely protein and carbs. If I'm like far away from a session that I have like enough time to digest the protein, but protein and carbs, definitely like the most important things. And then it's like, ideally we'd get a couple servings of fruit. Ideally we'd get at least 3 servings of veggies, and then a few servings of dairy and things like that. So we've talked about like positive relationship with food, eating consistently throughout the day, eating enough carbs. This next one has to do with like recovery. So I'm sure this is something you talk about with your clients, but recovery is really like your body's opportunity to like respond to the stress that you've just exposed it to and get stronger. And I think climbers struggle with recovery in general. And just like, not enough rest, not enough sleep. But having enough fuel is a significant part of that. And so what's recommended is like 0.3 grams per kilo of like high quality protein after. So like for most people, that's 15 to 25 grams. So like 15 to 25 grams of protein. An ounce of protein has 7 grams. So we're talking like, 3 to 4 ounces of chicken or 3 to 4 eggs, or and that's if you're not having protein in any of like your other foods. And then ideally that would be paired with 3 to 4 times that amount of carbohydrates. So like, let's say I'm having 20 grams, like last night I had probably around 20 grams of protein, maybe like 17 grams of protein. I probably had like, and I usually don't count, but last night I was curious. I was like, ooh, like what ratio am I landing at? And I probably had like 70, 75 grams of carbs. And that's kind of like the ideal protein to carb ratio. And the protein, so after exercise, your body is breaking down your muscles and then rebuilding them. And so having the amino acids is important for that, and then carbohydrates for your glycogen stores. Like that's what I think of as low hanging fruit, right? Like really small changes that you can make that make a massive difference. You don't have to go crazy with like and make massive changes as far as like training and things like that, but yeah, makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And for me, that's a funny thing when people look at nutrition, fitness, lifestyle, the go-to is always, what's the biggest change I could make? Right? What's the largest change I could change in my lifestyle? It's never sustainable.
Nope.
Right? Unless I say never. There is obviously some people who can really get that mindset going and put the work in. But at some point, you're gonna get tired, bored, and start to work into it. And I generally have come to a bit of belief that some people only do it after a while because they've committed so much effort by that point, so they carry on. It's like commitment bias.
Mm-hmm. But it's not something that you enjoy or like something that makes your life better. Yeah. And if it relies on willpower too, if it solely relies on willpower because it's such a big change, that's another reason why it won't be sustainable. Because like things are going to come up in your life that require your willpower instead, or you just run out of willpower altogether. Right. So yeah, I think when we think about the long-term, small sustainable changes, like that is how you transform your climbing or your relationship with food or like whatever other area of your life that you're focusing on, right? Like that's really where you see the long-term gains, like doing something small consistently versus making a huge change, but only keeping it up for a matter of days or weeks or, at the best months, right? But if it's not something that works its way into your life after that, like you lose all benefit.
If it's worth doing, do it. If you put effort into it, even if it's not really worth doing or suiting your lifestyle, it's not worth doing, don't do it. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of one of those things, like, if you genuinely believe it's worth doing, you have to find a way of doing it. And that usually means starting small and building a habit.
Right.
If it's not really got any long-term value, and you don't fully believe in it, just don't do it.
Right. Like put your focus on something else that is actually going to move the needle.
That's it. And I think that's really important. It's like, okay, let's say we are getting enough carbs in, but I still can't stop eating too many donuts. I know I'm not saying it's too many, but okay, well, could I make a change somewhere else or adapt that slightly? Because I obviously still like doing this. I do like donuts.
Yes. I just had someone, a friend of mine is just made me some custom like wooden donut earrings. I'm like insanely excited. So 5 would be focusing on food first over supplements. Yeah. So there definitely is a place for supplements, and especially for my plant-based athletes, right? Like, especially if you're vegan or you're vegetarian or you're just more plant-based, there are nutrient gaps that you can potentially fill, except for B12. You can't, well, B12 you could get from nutritional yeast. If you worked really hard, you could probably get everything. But it's very often unrealistic for people. So for those athletes, I'll usually make recommendations, and I do not recommend these lightly because I'm much, much, much more focused on food, but things like vitamin D. Here in the Northeast, a lot of people don't get enough vitamin D. Calcium can be tricky to get if you're plant-based and you're not doing like, the fortified plant-based milks, and then things like, omega-3s, things like that. But generally speaking, for most athletes, there's always exceptions, but for most athletes, you can get everything you need from, a balanced style of eating. And that really is the best. So like, let's say someone was going to take like an ergogenic aid. It might give them a certain percentage of a performance boost, but it's nothing in comparison to good fueling. And so like good fueling is your foundation, and then supplements are like at the tippity top, right? Yeah. Like they can still have an impact and they're still important, but like you want to be working on the things that are going to have the biggest impact first, really get those dialed, and then think about like, other things. Another thing to keep in mind with like supplements is they're largely unregulated by the FDA. They're not unregulated, but they're very loosely regulated. So for like medications, something has to be proven safe before it gets on the shelves, and they do all this testing and everything like that. And for supplements, it's the opposite. So anything can make it to market, and then the FDA actually has the burden of proof. So the FDA has to build a case and like prove that something is dangerous before it can even be considered to get like taken off. And so I'll recommend for people to like look for third-party testing. So that's insanely important. And what they're checking, is the active ingredient that you're paying for, is it in there, right? So like if you're doing a protein powder or you're doing a caffeine supplement or creatine or something like that, is it actually in there in the amount that they're saying it's in there? And then they also make sure, is it free of banned substances? Is it free of heavy metals and like other contaminants? And so seals that people can look for, you can look for NSF, you can look for USP. Those are the two that I see the most commonly, or search the brand and then search third-party testing, or search the brand name with NSF, USP, and see what comes up. But yeah, like generally speaking, know that, with balanced fueling, you can get most of what you need. And like, that's what's going to have the biggest impact. And then if you are going to choose a supplement, just making sure that you're really doing your research. Because unfortunately, you have to be an advocate for yourself. Like you're the only one watching out for you when it comes to like what you're putting in your body. And then supplements are expensive too, right? So, if that's a limit, a lot of times I would recommend, especially if you're working on the foundational fueling, I would recommend spending those dollars on coaching or on more diverse foods, like more whole foods, like that sort of thing.
And I think we've discussed this a bit before. Like for myself, I do take supplements, but it's a case of, for me, it's a convenience thing. I've just done an 8-hour day at the Craig.
Yeah.
I've been really busy. I didn't get home. I wasn't going to get home at my usual time to eat.
Yep.
I also just finished a long day exercising. So quick protein shake, jump in the car, come home, have a bit of a bite to eat before I speak to yourself. For me, I think that's good when it's convenient. Like not all of us can get the right amount of food on a lunchtime climbing session.
Right.
And I might be talking BS, but at least for somebody bigger like myself, if we're talking grams per kilogram.
Right.
Like, I'm 90 kilos. Like, it's not really a strength to weight issue with my climbing, but it does mean when we say like on a day we're looking at 1.2 to 1.4 grams of protein per kilo, that starts to become a very lot of protein.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I do that in eggs and chicken, that's a very lot of food.
Yeah,
Right?
100%. Absolutely. And that's where I think it's the nuance of if you could choose, food would be preferable.
Definitely.
But if it comes down to getting it in or not getting it in, relying on supplementation is totally better than not getting it in. And so I always, thank you for bringing that up, because I always want to make that clear. Like, if like, these products that come out and they're like, we've formulated the cleanest protein, whatever, like this is the most, whole food, whatever. It's like, there's no way that can beat food, but like it totally has a place. And so like, like having a multivitamin to like cover nutritional bases, or like if you don't get enough omega-3s because fatty fish is not something you enjoy, right? Or like that you're not going to be able to get in a meal, and having a protein shake is like the next best thing. I think there's totally a place for that.
Yeah. And that's like, there's a big discussion very regular recently within climbing about collagen supplements.
Oh,
the research on it is, at least what I've read, there's some for it and some against it, and some saying there isn't really.
It's still very early. It's very preliminary. So
when people ask whether or not I use it, I'm like, I do, but I don't use it for that. It goes really nicely in my coffee, and it's 16 grams first thing in the morning.
Right.
And I tend to train really early, so I have that with my breakfast and then get on my training. So again, it's a convenience thing.
Right.
And then I do use, I think we discussed about my very limited nutrition outtake for clients. If somebody's asking about whether or not they need to take protein shakes,
right,
I simply say, how much do you weigh?
Mm-hmm.
Or to start with, do you feel you're recovering well?
Right.
Right. If not, how much do you weigh? Let's take that with the recommendations that I can find online.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We'll take that with some loose recommendations.
Right.
And just track it for a day. Give me an example day.
Yeah.
If it's about the same sort of mark, I'm like, no, don't take supplements. Like, you're getting enough in.
Right.
If it's just a little bit over, could you tweak your diet slightly?
Right. Just be a little bit more intentional about making sure you're squeezing it in.
With adults, there's always the conversation of weight loss. And that goes down a similar path of, well, are you recovering well?
Right.
Then let's train. With the exception, and if you are concerned about your body for medical reasons, and this is literally as far as I go, it's not my opinion on their body, it's if they're concerned, then I'd rather them seek nutritional help, so then come training. Because if we're not recovering well, we're going to get injured more.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's really hard. And a lot of times what people need is like to get stronger, which is so hard to do if you're in a calorie deficit, right? And maybe their body's set point would be lower than it is right now. And that's best achieved through intuitive eating, right? Like, most traditional dieting, 95% people gain it back, 67% gain back more. And so, trying to lose weight in a way that's on that restrictive side tends to work in the short term, but just not in the long term, at least for the vast majority of people and for anyone who I've, ever worked with. And so then I think it's helpful, especially working, with a dietitian who, does have more like of an intuitive eating focus, because a lot of times overeating to me is like a symptom. It's not a problem. And if that's preventing someone from landing at a set point, like a weight that their body's really happy at, then the only way for that to stop would be to, resolve some of the triggers that are causing overeating. So much of which is oftentimes the dieting behavior, right? Because it causes the deprivation, it causes the restriction, it kind of promotes all of those negative, feelings around food and the guilt and everything like that. So I think that paired with, focusing on, getting stronger rather than getting lighter. And then if your body does want to be lighter, it will, as you learn to eat, more intuitively.
So you've mentioned intuitive eating quite a lot. So what is intuitive eating like on face value?
Yeah. So intuitive eating is eating for physical rather than like emotional. Oh, I want to be careful with how I say that, because there is a part of food that is emotional, and like that's not, so I guess when I say emotional eating, I'm talking about like more of the negative kind, but it's eating for physical rather than emotional reasons. It's eating what sounds good in an amount that feels good, right? So when I'm thinking about so like for lunch today, I go downstairs, I see a couple boxes of takeout in the fridge. There's a box of cake and there's a box of like chicken and rice. I had a little bit of the cake and I was like, you know what? That is not going to be what's going to make me feel good right now. I have a few hours left of work. I really want the chicken and the rice. You know, when we get off here, before I go climb, I may have some of that cake. Like that can be my pre-climbing carbs. But yeah, so it's choosing what you truly want versus what you think you should have. So it's choosing what you want, eating an amount that feels good, rather than like always finishing your food, or like not eating quite enough and stopping a meal when you're still a little bit hungry because you're like, well, that's the amount that I should have. Yeah. So eating what you want in an amount that feels good. And then, yeah, having a more positive relationship with food. So, you know, doing away with, like, there's a really incredible book out there called Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole. She's like the pioneer of this. There's so much research on intuitive eating. And that book kind of walks through 10 principles. The first of which is kind of rejecting the diet mentality. And then it's also honoring your hunger, making peace with food, kind of pushing back on the food police, like learning to respect your body. And then the last one is like gentle nutrition, which is last because it's really easy to turn like a desire to be healthy into like, to kind of like weaponize that and have your real priority to be lose weight rather than like to feel good. And so gentle nutrition kind of comes last. Same with like, you know, nutrition for climbing. It's really hard to fuel yourself when you have a negative relationship with food. And so, you know, when it comes to like someone choosing like a post-workout meal, I'll always have them defer to what they actually want. A lot of times they will want something balanced, but when they don't, having that thing that you actually want is like, you know, what's best. So like learning how to tune into, you know, hunger and fullness cues and things like that.
I know I'm going to binge on carbs, and this is very common, like very common scenario for me. I see a cheesecake, I eat the cheesecake, I feel guilty about it, I buy a second cheesecake, and then I have some protein and I realize that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Like it took me a while to learn that, like,
right, figuring out what you actually want.
Yeah. And it's like, I've just been training,
right,
and exercising. Like, I'm hungry. I want 4 slices of toast. Like, I just want to snack on. It's like, actually, can I put some egg with those toasts? Because that's probably going to help me recover it. And just having that recovery mindset. Yeah. And usually I have the protein and I'm like, actually that was it. I hit the nail on the head.
Right. Yeah. So it's learning how to figure out like, what are you feeling and what's going to make you feel the best right now, versus like, I think a lot of times when we think about eating it, you know, we eat because it's time to eat or something like that. Right. Or we won't eat because it's not time to eat. Right. But like honoring your hunger, it's just like recognizing that you're cold, or like recognizing that you have to pee. Right. You would never tell yourself, oh, I'm going to wait 1 hour and then I will go. Or like, I'm going to wait an hour and then I'm going to grab a sweater. It's like, no, you recognize the cue, you respond right away because you trust that it actually exists. And so it's getting more into a habit of that with food. And then also just recognizing that all the ways that we struggle with food, it's exactly what we've been taught to do. So we've been taught to think like this. We've been taught to not tune into our hunger and fullness cues. We've been taught to think about food in a negative way. And so just like we've been taught this for decades, you know, you can also recondition yourself and teach yourself to operate around, you know, food differently, which is like really cool.
Cool. There was one thing I wanted to ask, like, this might be similar to my reason. So I don't offer training plans, not isolated that people can download and go ahead and do, right? Because I like to work with the individual and match their lifestyle to training and make it work. Right. And I noticed, obviously, you don't offer meal plans.
I don't. Yeah. So I just did a reel on this week, or last week. So I don't offer meal plans because I want someone to, after working with me, like to not need me forever. if you have a meal plan, you require someone to keep supplying those to you forever. And then also they tend to be like more restrictive, and they don't necessarily equip you with tools and skills and knowledge to go about like transforming your fueling on your own. And like when I work with someone, we do not get to everything in 3 months. Like it's no way to do that. But by the time they're done working with me, they are well on their way and they know how to keep this process up on their own. And so that's like the biggest thing there. Like I want someone to actually have long-term transformation and to have sustainable results, which very, very rarely happens from a meal plan. And then also too, there's like, I mean, I would potentially one day have an online course where I would help someone walk through all of this on their own. But having that accountability, you know, like if you decide you're going to do something, it's 25% likely. If you talk to someone about it, it's 65%. If you have a time that you're going to sit down and meet with someone about it, it's 95%. And so I think that's why you and I can help people get results, you know, because it's that accountability piece.
And this is what, when I'm trying to help someone improve, what I always try to explain to them is the goal isn't to get them one gain, it's to develop them to be able to self-coach, to be able to assess themselves on the wall and see gains. So it's actually a process I've helped with helping other coaches by mentoring them to be coaches. And that process in teaching someone to be a climbing coach is no different than the process I use for helping someone get better with their climbing.
Exactly. And that is empowerment. Like that is true value, because anyone can go and read a book. And like, not to say that books are not valuable, but to actually figure out how to take that action or how to take that knowledge and translate it into action, like that really is where, you know, the value lies. Because that's something that you can continue to do for the rest of your life in multiple areas of your life. Not that you're never going to need coaching for something down the road, right? I think definitely like that can continue to be helpful. But yeah, absolutely.
When people do stay along with me for a long period of time, which a lot of people do tend to, the conversations become very much they're answering the questions before I ask them, because they're proposing the struggle, explaining the process they need to go through, and giving me the answer. Right?
Like you facilitate them, their own self-learning almost. Yeah, so there's a lot of great intuitive eating resources out there. I post a lot about this on my page. If someone wants me to send me a DM, I have a lot of I have a list of accounts that I keep as just like, you know, good accounts to follow. There's a couple really good podcasts out there. So yeah, lots of free ways to just, you know, learn more. And I feel like that's helpful too, because the diet mindset is socially and culturally the norm. And so surrounding yourself with, you know, like the other half of the conversation can be really helpful when someone's trying to work through this, and just to sort of normalize it, like, oh yeah, intuitive eating is a thing, and like people are doing it and it works, and like this could be something that, you know, would like work for me. So yeah, and I love answering questions in my DMs. I post about everything pretty much that I coach about, so I really don't hold back. And so a lot of the content that we cover in coaching is over and over again in my feed. And so, yeah, if someone's kind of keen to, you know, learn more about like nutrition for climbing, intuitive eating, definitely lots of content.
Thank you for sticking with us and listening. I hope that conversation was as helpful as you as it was for me. I'd like to apologize a little bit for audio quality. I've just come back from the Peak District and I was really windswept. If you'd like to learn more about nutrition, get in touch with Climbing Dietitian on Instagram, or visit Chiara directly on her website at betabitesnutrition.com. And if you'd like to learn more about taking on a climbing coach and seeing gains in your personal climbing, don't hold back on getting in touch. You can visit me at climbing.coach on Instagram, or head straight over to rocksense.co.uk.